Wisconsin in Words is a Wisconsinite feature with interviews of Wisconsin authors. Today's author is very special, Governor Scott Walker, who wrote Unintimidated, A Governor's Story and a Nation's Challenge. Governor Walker, thanks for visiting Wisconsinite to talk about Unintimidated.
Yeah, glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I've read the book, gone through it, marked it up, except it seems to me this was your attempt to say, these were the decisions Wisconsin faced. This is how I made them, this is why I made them, and I think there's some national lessons. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. It's the how, the what, and probably most importantly, the why. Because I think many people, not only across the country, but even some people here in this state, didn't really fully understand or appreciate the why we did what we did. And then, as you mentioned, there are lessons to be shared with other states across the country.
When, with your busy schedule, did you find time to write it, sir?
You know, in our case, the reason why I put my co-author on the front, unlike a lot of politicians who have ghostwriters and pretend that they wrote it themselves, was because I wanted people in the state to know that I had someone professionally help me set a book up. But these are my stories, this is my word. And what we did is every Sunday night, see how different things are in the new age of electronic media, every Sunday night from about 6 to 9:30 at night, Mark and I would Skype back and forth from his home outside of D.C. and my home in Wauwatosa. And for about 6 months, that's how we put it together.
Whose idea for a book? Yours?
Yeah, I had a number of people approach me and say, you should really tell this story out there. But as I looked around and I looked at different publishers, I really wanted to make sure that this wasn't some typical politician run for some other office book. People will be surprised. There is no biography here. There's no... my youth isn't discussed. I don't talk about how I became an Eagle Scout or what I did.
You mentioned the Eagle Scout once, but
I mentioned Eagles, but I don't tell the path. There's no narrative in that regard. It's really the story about what we accomplished here in the state of Wisconsin.
I've got several specific questions. You ready? You repeatedly use the term corruption and cronyism to describe the tactics of public employee union leaders. Were those union leaders guilty of anything breaking the law,
no,
do you think?
Not to my knowledge. But what I think is it's a fundamentally corrupt system in the sense that there's a vicious cycle I talk in the book, in that money from the taxpayers goes for legitimate wages and benefits, but on top of that, it then goes for union activities that aren't just union activities, they're political activities. They then go interview candidates who say, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to add more positions. I'm going to add more benefits. I'm going to spend more government money. Nowhere in that cycle does anyone stand up for the hardworking taxpayers. And it's not just an observation I made. I've pointed this out before. Even people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt raised serious concerns about the need for public sector unions. On top of all that, though, was this automatic deduction of dues that happened throughout the process. And for many people I heard over the years, they didn't want that. They preferred not to have that happen. Well, now they get to have that choice.
And you make the point that that automatic collection of dues was the first issue of these of the union leaders. That's really most what they cared about.
Yeah, it was pretty clear to me as things went on that we could have given almost anything as long as they got to keep those dues. They didn't make the specific offer, but it was pretty clear they would have paid much higher amounts for pension, much higher amounts for health care, as long as they got their hands on the money that they automatically got. And it makes sense because, as I mentioned in the book, if you're a teacher in Milwaukee and you don't have to pay $1,400 for union dues, instead you can use that to save up for your kids' college education or pay for your pension or health care contributions. Many employees, not only in the schools, but in other areas in public service, would opt to do that, and that's what they really wanted their hands on.
And you don't pull any punches. On page 44, you say, or we could take the money from the unions. I decided to take it from the unions.
That's exactly right. To me, you look at the choices out there, $3.6 billion budget deficit, just about like every other state in the country. We could have raised taxes dramatically, but we saw what happened in Illinois when they did that. It hurt the economy. You could have massive layoffs of public employees like other states did. In our case, it would have been tens of thousands. To me, that's not a very good idea. That would hurt the economy as well. Or you could cut things like Medicaid, which would affect needy families, children, and seniors out there. Or you could do what we did, which is in our state where more than half the budget is money that goes to local governments.
Turn back to local
You pull that back, but having been a local official myself, I knew the only way, because remember Jim Doyle and the legislature did it before, not at this level, but they cut money from schools and local governments. They just didn't give us any tools when I was in local government to respond to it. I knew as a local official we needed to have a way to change, and so by taking that away from the people that really, in this case, the people that cared were the union leaders, all the other alternatives would have been much worse off.
Your book, Act 10 was good public policy, you say that, but hasn't it also been good politics for you since it greatly reduced the cash public employee unions can spend to vote you out of office next year?
Well, I'm sure you look at what the AFL-CIO announced. If that was the target, it didn't work very well, because the AFL-CIO announced in August of this year, they were going to target 6 governors in America, shift money from federal congressional races to the states. I was one of the 6, and just a week or 2 back, several others announced that they believe the AFL-CIO was going to spend as much as $20 million, which is unprecedented. So even though the money isn't coming from
just in
state,
Wisconsin,
just in Wisconsin, yeah, that's what one of the comments that was passed on to me was expressed, that they'd be spending that kind of money. So I think it is clear, the 6 of us, I'm one, if not at the top, near the top of that list, because they want to send a message. They want to send a message to other governors, be they Republican or Democrat, and other mayors. I mean, think about what happened to Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, and governors or mayors in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, other places like this. They're realizing that they have real troubles as well, and if they don't rein in these out-of-control benefits, they're not going to have much money left to spend on their taxpayers.
I want to ask you about 3 specific quotes in the book. Page 127, talking about the importance of Justice Prosser's April 2011 election. You write, "So while I was not on the ballot that day, my political fate and the fate of our reforms certainly were, and we won." This is my follow-up question. Doesn't that statement predict how Justice Prosser will rule in the Act 10 case that's now before the court, or tell him how to rule?
No, I think in this case the difference was he didn't comment one way or the other. What we saw in contrast was his opponent made it clear, and I document that throughout the book in statements time and time again. She made it clear, and not just in advocates for her, but in her own campaign, making the appeal to voters to support her, to vote for her, that they needed to send a message about me and our campaign. And so that's really what our point was.
Okay, and then on page 56, you write this: "If the law had allowed me to be recalled in 2011 instead of 2012, I would almost certainly have lost." Why?
Well, because I think, much like we saw in Ohio, if people don't get to see the positive effects of the reform, they bought into the arguments. Remember, early in 2011, when all this was happening, not only was there this intense pressure and focus by the media almost exclusively on the statements and beliefs of the protesters, not on any countermeasure, that unless you had a counter-protest of that size, many in the media, at least in my opinion, portrayed as though it was all one-sided, that it was just people who had concerns about the proposal, and there was very little substantive coverage giving the counter to that, the logical counter to that. But beyond that, you had the unions literally in here spending millions of dollars on campaign-style ads against me even at that point. And so our approval rating, I think in something like April and May of 2011, was in the 30% range, which clearly I would have lost.
You write about 37%.
Yeah. And why I say that changed, though, is 2 big things happened I talk about in the book. One, in September, when parents all across the state sent their kids back to public schools, including Toinette and I, because both our kids were at Wauwatosa East High School at that point, people found that their schools were the same, or in many cases better, because of our reforms for the districts that used them. And then a few months after that, in December, when property tax bills came out, people saw that their property taxes, for the first time in about a dozen years, had actually gone down, at least down on the median valued home. Suddenly people said, wait a minute. They told me how awful this was. They told us the world was going to come to an end, theoretically or figuratively. And yet, schools are doing fine, local governments are doing fine, property taxes are down. We could start to see and feel that change that was happening. And then, of course, we started running our own ads going into the recall election. But I'm convinced more than any ad or flyer we put out, it was the actual tangible results people saw in their own homes, in their own communities, on their own property tax bills that really made the difference.
Is that law that says you have to wait a week? I'm sorry, excuse me. I misspoke. You have to wait 1 year before you can recall a state official. Is that a pretty good provision then? It worked for you.
Well, I think that part makes sense, because look at the difference in Ohio. I remember when Ohio lost, people said, what does this mean about Wisconsin? So what it means is voters never had a chance to see the reforms work in the Buckeye State.
Right.
They had more than a year to see them work in Wisconsin, and I think that made all the difference in the world.
They also, the state of Ohio also included firefighters and police officers. Referendum voted it down, just threw it out prior to these changes in collective bargaining even starting.
Right.
Right. But let's continue on the issue of recalls. You got elected Milwaukee County executive once Tom Ament faced a potential recall. Do you like the recall changes to the Constitution that have passed the Assembly and are pending in the Senate? Well,
and go back for a second on what happened with me. Tom Ament faced a recall under pressure, resigned. I ended up in a special election, so I didn't get elected in a recall. But I think it was pretty clear at the time the intent of the law, not the way it's written, but the intent of it as it is in many other states, and I think even in the Milwaukee County case, was for misconduct in office. It wasn't because people disagreed solely with the policy. The policy had passed years before. It was when people learned what actually happened. They learned about the millions of dollars of these lump sum pension benefits and how a handful of people who were close to my predecessor, had gained from that people were outraged because of that, and initially started the recall petition. Now, again, he resigned. I think in the state or the case of what's being proposed here in the state, to me, I think having the option for a recall makes sense, but I think most other states across America have some sort of ability to tie that into misconduct in office, because the idea being we should be able to remove someone in office if they've done something that's not just something we disagree with, but something that's wrong, that either legally or ethically is tremendously wrong, versus just having a disagreement, which I think is where most people say, hey, wait a minute, including some of the people that probably not only voted for me, but maybe even voted for some of those senators. They didn't just vote for our policies. They probably in many ways said, you know what, whether I agree or disagree fully, a candidate should have a chance to serve their term, and then if we like or dislike them, then have their say after the term's up.
Constitutional amendments, as you know, go around the governor, but you'll get a chance to vote on them. It sounds to me like you would be voting if they are the subject of a referendum to make these changes, the new limits on recalls?
Yeah, again, I think if it's limited to misconduct in office or something in that regard, it makes sense.
I was also intrigued when you...
Although I should just add, I think in the end going forward, I can't imagine with or without these provisions, I just cannot imagine, at least statewide, there ever being a realistic attempt for a recall again on anybody, Democrat or Republican alike, because I think most people in the state said, you know what, that was a big waste of time, big waste of money. It needlessly drew the state apart. We don't need to push a recall. We'll give somebody a chance, and if we don't like what they're doing, we'll find somebody else to vote for.
February 11 of 2011, you come out with Act 10, the provisions. You want it passed within a week. You make the statement in here, once it dragged on because the senators left, you ran out of messaging material. I find that very intriguing.
Yeah, because, well, even more ironic is that early on, and because we didn't gear up to do a fight about this to draw attention to the abuses and the examples, in part because here I talked about in the campaign, I'd run an ad that said we should have a 5% and a 12% contribution for pension and health care respectively. Got in, realized it was even bigger than what we thought, and so realized we needed to go beyond just state employees, and particularly in December, when the state public employee union said no and tried to ram through contracts, it became clear they had no interest in bargaining. So we knew we had to go a little bit bigger than we originally had thought. But in all this, the irony is I never anticipated that we would make issue of some of the abuses, because I didn't want, this is the irony, I didn't want it to appear as though I was going after public employees. Now, of course, that just the opposite happened, that the length amount of time went on that the union leadership themselves made their members feel like they were under attack. But we hadn't stored up all these examples. We had to go out and find them, and as you can imagine, over time, as we talked to local officials and others across the state, they gave us example after example, many of which I give in the book, of the abuses of the few. Just so it's clear, I still believe the vast majority of public employees in the state at the state and local level, 300,000 strong, are good, decent, hardworking people. It's just in the past, collective bargaining protected some of the people who weren't, and that's why it had to change, amongst other reasons.
The drama on March 9, you meet with the Senate GOP caucus. You're understanding that they're not going to push it that day. You say the decision by Senate Majority Leader Fitzgerald for a quick push for the conference committee surprised you. But you had wanted Act 10 introduced, debated, passed in a week. So for Fitzgerald to put down the accelerator, isn't there a contradiction? You wanted Act 10, a major change passed in a week, so you're upset when Fitzgerald said, we're going to do it today?
It surprised me. I don't know if I'd say upset. And in the end, as I mentioned in the book, it actually ended up being better than what we thought. But at the time, we thought, okay, here we just talked about it. Here was our plan. I think to Senator Fitzgerald's credit, what he felt was a pressure within his caucus that he thought that they were restless. They wanted to go. They didn't want to drag this out anymore. And so that's why he responded the way he did. In the end, it probably worked out just fine. But early on, the reason why we'd pushed this was, we'd looked 2 years before when Jim Dole had a budget repair bill. He introduced it in less than 24 hours. They had a vote. They had no public hearing, and they raised taxes by, I believe, over $1 billion to do that. we were going to take a week to 10 days to do this. We thought if we were going to address the $3.6 billion budget deficit in the budget, why not, as we did the budget repair bill to address the $137 million gap that we had left over from Doyle's last term, why not do it then, help that balance the budget and set the framework for what we were going to do in the biennial budget? And why not do something in a budget repair bill that would only take about a week to 10 days instead of dragging on months and months of the kind of pressure we thought would come if you did put it in the budget, as opposed to doing what we did in the final version.
But that's kind of speaks to the advice that you were given. Be bold, act fast. What's the third one? Do you remember?
Well, with Daniels, and he said, and then take your political capital and reinvest it.
Yes.
He talked about the idea that you don't get it by hoarding it, you get it by reinvesting it. So what we've tried to do ever since then is not just be bold on collective bargaining reform and budgetary reform. We've done it in tax reform, cut taxes $1.5 billion, another $100 million in property tax relief. We've done it in education reform, doing things for both traditional public schools, charter schools, as well as expanding school choice around the state. Be bold in entitlement reform, transitioning people from government dependence to true independence. Those are the things we're going to continue to do going forward.
When you left that Senate caucus on March 9, I remember you were going to then fly around the state. So it was your understanding that the Senate was going to act, Senate GOP was going to act on March 10, the next day. Do you think they would have lost the votes to pass it had they waited until March 10? 24 hours?
Oh, I don't know if they would have lost the votes, but I think that was one of their concerns. I just think in general they felt all this pressure. They thought they were going to come bearing down on them and that they needed to act while they had the time and they had the opening. As we mentioned, and I'm talking about in the book, rather riveting discussion that people didn't know about it from outside the state, to talk about how part of our plan was we wanted to be systematic to make sure everyone was safe and accounted for and things of that nature. Here, Mike Hipps, the Secretary of Administration, had sent some of the police officers and others from law enforcement home because the plan was it was going to take a couple days. We were going to work this out.
Right.
We had an exact schedule. And then lo and behold, they acted. And that's where the shock came in. That's where it wasn't because of the timing. It wasn't because of the politics. It was really more than anything about the concern over public safety, because it seems hard to remember today, but at that time, this wasn't just about political pressure. We were seriously, legitimately concerned about the safety of these state lawmakers. And as we put on the book, I mean, remember, they had to take off through the tunnel, come out, get escorted by law enforcement into a bus where they were literally told to lean down, cover their heads so that they wouldn't get hit by shattered glass, because that's how intense they thought it was. This isn't a third world country. This is something that was happening right here in Madison, Wisconsin. And that part, I think many people don't really realize just how intense it was.
Another detail that I didn't know, you went through the tunnel at one point and you said, what's that? And it was the gas mask had been activated and the State Patrol was told to go to full riot gear?
Right. We had, for days, I would come down this tunnel and there'd be these piles, these mounds of bags that had the SWAT gear in for the various different outposts of law enforcement directed by the State Patrol. But that particular day, they had the filter out that comes out of that, and they were prepared.
Which is the next step,
right,
prior to...
They were prepared. I mean, it looked like something out of, one of these movies out there where people were geared up and ready, because repeatedly we had seen the actions that people were willing to take. So for all the talk about peaceful, there were certainly plenty of people that are peaceful, and I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, but there were many, and particularly as there were more and more coming in from out of state, there were many, as we show in this book, and we show even some of the pictures of that, who were really ready to storm the Capitol and who didn't care about what law enforcement said. They were going to go forward and be as disruptive as possible.
I learned also some pretty graphic and pretty scary details about the threats to you and your family. Let me ask you this. Do you and your family feel more safe now, 2.5 years later?
Absolutely. We followed the advice of law enforcement. I would not restrict my public schedule. I still went out, even in 2011, around the state and went to events and did things. But for myself, and remember my kids at the time, both in college now, but we're both in a public school. Great credit to Nick Hughes, the principal at Wauwatosa East. Great credit to the teachers there and the DARE officers from the Wauwatosa Police Department, because they really looked out for Matt and Alex as though they were their own. Thank goodness I kept them there, because they knew them as Matt and Alex, not as the governor's sons. But there were times where we would get heads up about things. We'd have to move the kids around. We'd have to move my parents around. We'd move them out of the house. There were real risks, and as the book points out, there was one in particular. I mean, I had a stack, this high from the ground up of death threats. But one of the most vivid ones was one that my head of my detail brought in right before a press conference. It was directed to Tonette.
I know.
And it's just unbelievable. I mean, it talked about me being assassinated. It talked about even worse, maybe we should do something to some of your kids. It wasn't just the threat, and that enough is vulgar, but it was telling about where the kids went to school, what doors they went in, talking about where we lived, where my wife worked, where my father-in-law lived, where my parents lived. I mean, again, these are the sorts of things you only envision in a third world country, not in a place like Wisconsin in the United States. And thankfully none of that happened, but it wasn't without legitimate concern from objective law enforcement professionals who oftentimes well, I'd still do public events, they would ask us to go in different ways or to take different safety precautions, and we listened to them.
In a potentially close election, do you think we'll see this level of emotion come back over the next 10 months, sir?
I hope not. I mean, I think in the end, I don't think it was a good thing. I think having passion for your beliefs is great. I mean, whether people agree with me or disagree, I don't mind with that. I mean, I hope the one thing I showed time and time again was my tolerance for people, no matter how vulgar or distasteful they would be. The one thing I just don't have a whole lot of tolerance for, not just against me, but against anyone, is the idea that someone would physically feel threatened, whether it was lawmakers, whether it was a senator, a representative, a member of our cabinet, someone being for or against anything. I would say the same thing. In fact, I did. Early in 2011, I spoke out against the folks who had targeted Gabby Giffords, the congresswoman from Arizona. Even some on the left acknowledged that it was good that someone like me had come out and spoke out in unity with the president and others. It was amazing to me, as I mentioned in the book, the silence from those on the left just a month and a half later, when the same sorts of attacks, the same sorts of pictures with the crosshairs on, the signs that said a good Republican's a dead Republican, aim and reload, those sorts of things that I don't think have any place in American politics, be it on the left or the right or anywhere in between. It was amazing, the silence. And to this day, one of the things that surprised me the most was that there were no other elected officials, local or state, on the opposing party line who ever reached out to me, to my wife, to my family, and said, we disagree with the policies, but it's just not right. That this never happened. And that to me is shocking, because to me in this state, that's the sort of thing I'd expect, that people would say, I disagree with you, I'm going to fundamentally fight you on the policy, I'm going to fight to elect someone different, but the tactics used are just disrespectful. 2.5
years later, do you think public employee benefits are still too generous, sir?
No, for me it was never about whether they were too high or too low. It was really about the options that we had on the table. In fact, a lot of times I was talking on public radio today and someone brought that up. I said, you didn't hear me make the case as to whether they're too high and too low. You can use all sorts of statistics either way to say that they're too high when compared to the private sector. You could add in amount of college credit and advanced degrees and say they're too low compared to others. I mean, you can make a pretty strong case either way. It was never about the level of public employee compensation or overall benefits. It was about the choices that we had, and of all the choices, it's why in the end, as I talk about in the book, for many of the long-term members of the legislature who were not really thrilled with this idea of what we proposed in the first place, in the end, the reason they went along was there was no better choice. There really was no other viable option out there.
John Doe 1 was used by your opponents as a reason to recall you in 2012. Do you expect John Doe 2 to hurt your re-election chances?
I don't expect that, no, but I don't know enough to know even what they're looking at or what they're looking for to even know what it may or may not happen.
Okay. One more quote from the book. On page 236, you write this: "When I took that prank call from the fake David Koch, it was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. I learned from the experience to be humble." I want to ask you this. How do you stay humble when you're on the A list as a Republican presidential candidate? You're flown all around the nation. People want to hear from you. How do you stay humble in light of this? You have many fans in your party.
Well, it's one of those. I mean, that particular moment, and again, this is why that book is a little bit unlike traditional political books. It's all rah rah and aren't we great kind of a story. And I speak a chapter about just how stupid, what an idiot I was, not just for taking the call, but because I had no
embarrassing moments in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never met David Koch before. He's a major employer. Georgia Pacific employs several thousand people in Green Bay, so it wasn't illegitimate for me to take a call from him or anyone else who was an employer in this state. What I believed was embarrassing, what made me feel like an idiot that I was wasn't taking the call. I mean, that was dumb, but it was what I said. It was, and it wasn't even the things that the media honed in on. It was how I talked about all the attention we were getting, all the shows we were on. I sounded completely full of myself. And it was after the fact. In fact, the title of this chapter comes from this particular devotional. There's a devotional that Gary Baez, the state representative from Door County, had given me that's on my desk by John Maxwell called Leadership.
He also gave me a copy. Go
yeah,
ahead.
It's a great book. And ironically, that particular day as I'd come in, before I could even go into my office and look at the devotional, the staff got me and wanted to know what I was going to do. And I said, well, it's me, and I'm not going to fudge or say it wasn't. I'm going to go right out and have a press conference and be held accountable for it. After I got done, I went back to my office. My staff gave me a few minutes to decompress. I looked, and there was that book, opened it up for that date.
Humility.
Yeah, The Power of Humility, The Burden of Pride. And I'm like, I hear you, Lord. I mean, it was clear message to me, and I don't think God picks sides in politics. You know, President Lincoln had it right. He said, God doesn't pick sides. He calls us to be on his side. And it was just a great lesson for me that I really should have remembered from my youth, from my parents, which is the only time you get yourself into trouble is when you start thinking more about yourself than about the people around you you're trying to serve. And so that to me was a great reminder then that I apply to all the different examples you gave in the question.
Well, just a very quick follow-up. Have you since met David Koch? And if so, did you talk about this prank call?
Never talked to him about that. I of all places, bumped into him on the floor of the Republican National Convention. He was out there, I guess, from New York State, said hi and moved on.
Okay. On page 237, you list 4 questions on the minds of Wisconsin voters. 2 of the 4 involve jobs. Why does your book not mention your 2010 campaign goal of creating 250,000 new private sector jobs by the end of the first term?
Legitimate question. I'm very proud of that pledge in my campaign, and I'm committed to it, and I'll come back and touch on where we're at in a second. But the reason for the book is simple. This is not a biography. This is not a tell-all. This is not the comprehensive review of Scott Walker's life and career. This is really the story of our reforms, which are unique to Wisconsin, which is a story I thought would be interesting. It's the same reason or a similar reason, I shouldn't say the same, to when Steven Spielberg made the movie Lincoln. He didn't take the book Team of Rivals and cover the whole book. He took a piece of it, the 13th Amendment, which was one of the more compelling parts of that book, and made that into the movie. That's what we did with the book. We took one part of our story that we thought was the most compelling and the most interesting to the people of the state and to the people of the country. Per the 250,000 jobs, we're very committed to it. The reason I picked that pledge in the first place was because when I ran for governor, I saw the devastation in the last term before I was governor. I saw the fact that in total, under Jim Doyle, we lost more than 133,000 jobs in the state, and what that meant not just for the people who lost the jobs, but for their families and for communities. And so I set a very ambitious, very aggressive goal of helping the people of the state by 2015 create 250,000 jobs. I'm still committed to going down that path because I want to not only make up for the jobs we lost under the old policies that failed, but do even more to set us up for the future so that we're in a much better position no matter what happens on a national stage.
Almost out of time, just a couple more questions. Since the book has been published, any error in it that's been called to your attention that you'd like to correct, sir?
Yeah, there was one, I think it was when I referenced Alberta Darling's recall campaign. I think I talked about $8 million as that was amount against her. I think $8 million we found later when we were looking at the numbers of the total amount spent. But in terms of any of the others, I don't recall any that we found where we weren't essentially on the money.
You mentioned Governor Christie 2 or 3 times. Is he qualified to be president?
Absolutely. I think any of the 30 Republican governors would be a marked improvement from this president.
Your book is selling fairly well, at least on the politics and government list, excuse me. Will you use these royalties to write up your upcoming college tuition checks for Matt and Alex, or do you have some other purpose for the profits?
No, in our case, it's one of those where by the time, there's not a whole lot left by the time I paid my co-author, Mark Tyson, who's an accomplished author. I wanted to make sure I had somebody who knew how to write a book. And in particular, that's why I put him on the front page, because I don't think you should hide behind a ghostwriter. You should write it with them. As I mentioned, we wrote it every Sunday night. But I wanted the people in my state to know that I didn't spend every day of every week writing a book, that I actually told the story, put it together, put it in my words, but had someone else help. And so part of it goes to him, part of it goes to your agent. By the time you're done, the rest will go to probably more than anything tuition.
Tuition. And then final question is a trivia question. You mentioned in your book how protesters and their supporters helped keep Ian's Pizza thrive. Have you had a piece
I've never
of
had it. I should probably do it, but I've never had it.
Okay. Governor Scott Walker, thanks so much for talking about Unintimidated, a governor's story and a nation's challenge. Thank you so much, sir.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.